morning, good evening to everybody. IT, along with its partners, would like to welcome you all on this webinar on learning losses amidst COVID-19. The education system has been severely impacted by the unprecedented global education emergency caused by COVID-19, as we all know. And I believe that it is very imperative for all of us to discuss this further. COVID-19 has altered every aspect of our lives, introducing abrupt changes to the way governments, schools, communities, and families operate. The crisis offers an important reflection point for all education leaders to question the rapidly exacerbating learning losses and explore new evidence-based approaches for delivering quality education to more than 1 billion children who are still at home at the moment. Thus, this webinar brings together the thought leaders and practitioners to discuss the options available for education of all children and share the practices which are the most relevant in the context of developing countries in general and Pakistan in particular. We hope that by the end of the seminar, we'll be having many stories for hope and recommendations to deal with the crisis. So I'll stop here and Bela, I would like to introduce Bela Javed, CEO ITA, who's going to be moderating the session, and she will be introducing the speakers. We have a few housekeeping rules. As you all can see that, the participants who are attending, thank you so much for taking out the time for this. But you can leave your question answer sessions under the question answer box. And if somebody has a burning question, they can raise their hands and we'll make sure that they speak to the relevant, they'll ask the question to the relevant speaker. But once they leave their question under the question answer session, we'll make sure that we answer them all during the conversation or towards the end, or even if some questions left unanswered, we'll make sure that we can pass them on to the speaker so that they can answer them afterwards. So thank you very much. Over to Bela now.
Thank you, Seher. I absolutely have the greatest pleasure today to be moderating this session. And it is indeed a star-studded cast from all over the world and from Pakistan. People who are passionate about this whole issue, crisis and learning losses. What I thought it would be good before I introduce the panelists is to just set the stage briefly on the issue. And we have a short PowerPoint that Seher is going to just share with us. Do we have a shared screen, Seher?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just share that? So the idea, as we know, we've been looking at the issue of learning crisis since 2015 and even before. Seher, is the presentation coming up?
Yes.
So if we look at the learning crisis, we look at USER. Next, please. Can you give the full screen, please? So USER has been, of course, notoriously tracking the learning crisis. And if we look at just in terms of who can read for the national rural results in Pakistan in the USER 2019 report, we see that 14% in grade 8, 41% in grade 5, and 82% in grade 3 cannot read with basic comprehension in Urdu, Sindhi, Pashto. And this is a major crisis. And of course, with that, there are the inter and the intra-wealth quartile gaps. So even in the poorest of the quartiles, we see there's a big difference between boys and girls in the poorest groups, where the girls' learning remains precariously low. And enter COVID. Next, please. Next, please. So if we look at the COVID situation, can we go before that? If you look at the COVID situation, we look at UNESCO's data with 1.6 billion learners in 188 countries, not suddenly, being shut away from schools with school closures. Pakistan also, from March onwards, mid-March, we've had preschool to tertiary, all education and technical vocational institutions shut down and likely to open on the 15th of September. We have a very well-documented aspect of not just the learning crisis, but also the learning loss. And this recently updated study by Dr. Das, Daniels, and Andrabi which shows just with 14 weeks of children staying away from schools during the earthquake of 2005 in Azad Jammu Kashmir, it is later, 4 years later, there's a recorded loss of 1.5 to 2 full years. Next, please. And if we then, and that has been further substantiated by studies in Ghana. Next slide, please. And where we see that the inequalities that are there in society, they will grow and remain in terms of children who may not be able to catch up in their learning, even when they transit into schools when they reopen. And of course, that this COVID-19 will increase economic pressures on vulnerable households. Rukmini Banerjee, a friend and also a colleague in the PAL network and head of Pratham, keeps on saying the same thing, that hardships faced by families will have major consequences when it comes to issues of disruptions and discontinuity. So we need to bear up to that. And that means there will be major compromises on SDG 4 goal and targets for learning, equity, and quality. Amidst all this, we have recently, as a whole group, the People's Action for Learning Network, has launched this new International Common Assessment of Numeracy tool. And it's a wonderful tool for numeracy, covering 13 countries in 3 continents and 11 languages, which is a very child-friendly and a robust lower primary tool to assess and diagnose what these learning losses could be, because they are mapped to a global competency framework. And these have been just launched on the 9th of July and endorsed by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. We'll have more of that later, but just to say there are things which are happening and cooking as we are talking, and there are ways to be able to look at, happy ways to be able to look at the diagnosis of learning. Next, please, the last slide. So Rukmini says, in a recent blog, she says, okay, when schools reopen, what should we think of? Even though we know there's a doom and gloom scenario, we have to be able to see some kind of celebration when schools reopen after 6 months. We have to be able to connect so that when the schools are ready, children come to school. We must be able to meet the children in that connection, maybe with this one simple one-on-one oral assessment, such as I Can and others like that. And we have to catch up, because it has to be an issue where we are committed to foundational learning. Can we have some clear goals so that at least for every child, grade 3 and above, we can think in terms of basic text fluency and see whether the children can do those foundational learning of reading and arithmetic before the next summer, and recognize the community of parents, other community members, and the roles that they have played during the school closure, but also after reopening, because these spaces have fused. I just stop at that in terms of what kind of questions are buzzing in our heads when it comes to issues of learning crisis and learning losses and the prospects of schools reopening. I'm absolutely delighted at this point to be able to share with you the people that we have today, the wonderful panelists who've given their absolutely wonderful time and thought to this session. We have with us Cohn Given. He's an economist at the World Bank, where he co-leads several investment projects in education across South Asia. And his research focus is the dynamics between inequality, public policy, and education. And of course, he's also interested in the research on the measurement of learning crisis. We have also with us Jonathan Stern, who is working in research and evaluation within RTI's International Education Division. And he has been involved in quantitative methods, research design, measurement and assessment, and program monitoring and evaluation. And recently, Dr. Stern has been investigating the impacts of COVID-19 school closures on learning losses, both internally at RTI and collaboratively with researchers at the University of Cambridge Rail Center. The reference that I was giving to Ricardo's study or the blog recently posted on UCFIAT side website. Then we have with us Kate Anderson. She's the founder and director of Unbounded Associates in DC. She has more than 18 years of experience, but her passion is research and practice, including providing technical and strategic support, working so closely with Idara Talim o Agahi in Pakistan, and also the Grace Association in Pakistan as well. Of course, one of the major heroes of today, I say hero because he's followed by so many students, it's unbelievable. Dr. Faisal Bari, they are stalkers who stalk him everywhere so that they don't miss out on what pearls of wisdom he has to share with everyone. He's an economist and is working in the areas of research and teaching. His areas are economics of education, social protection, industrial organization, and economic development. He's currently a senior research fellow and CEO at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, IDEAS, and is also the interim Dean of Education at the Lahore University, School of Education at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, something which was really hugely hailed as he came in. The announcement came that he was the interim dean. So looking forward to that. And last but not least, very important is Dr. Shehzad Jiva, who's currently also the chairman of IBCC, the Inter-Board Committee of Chairman of all the boards of Pakistan. He is also the director of the examination board at the Aga Khan University and holds appointment as the assistant professor of Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the Aga Khan University. He has been playing an amazing role in improving the educational system of Pakistan, has worked with the Asian Development Bank and works closely with the government of Sindh and the governments of Balochistan on assessment systems. But also, Shehzad is an amazing human being. And whenever I've seen him training head teachers, teachers on assessments, truly the issue of learning crisis, learning gains really becomes almost as if it is within reach of every head teacher and teacher. So without further ado, we will proceed now with each of our panelists. The format is going to be as follows. We will have 7 to 8 minutes of presentations. Maybe Koen will go with about 8 minutes. And then if there are any burning questions in the Q&A, we will ensure that to that particular speaker, panelist who's presented, we will immediately ensure that we can get to those 2 burning questions, and then we move to the next panelist in the same order. Our participants are most welcome to put their questions in the Q&A section, and those questions will be curated by Seher and by Abzan, who are helping us out in this webinar, and we will make sure that we'll have a second round to ask all the questions to the relevant panelists to whom they are being directed. So without much ado, may I request Koen to join us as the first panelist and lay the ground on the whole issue that he's been working on for some time. As you know, World Bank last year launched this entire area of learning poverty, giving a new twist to the issue of learning crisis, and in comes COVID-19 with the learning loss crisis. So Koen, we would love to hear you from the perspective, the global perspective, macro, and then coming back to also our context and the way forward, the way you see it. So over to Koen first, and Koen has a presentation. And I promise to everyone that we will be sharing the link to the entire webinar as well as to the presentation. So you'll have all the presentations. Can we have the full screen, please? Koen, are you there?
Thank you so much, Bela. Yes, I'm here. It's early morning here, which is much appreciated actually, because my son, who's 2-year-old, is still asleep, which is a rare moment of bliss in my house. But the rare moment of bliss in my house, I'm sure all of you who have children will recognize as this enormously challenging period over the last few months. I was just thinking while you were speaking, Bela, the last time we met each other was when I was in Pakistan, was on the 13th of March, which was 2 days before the school system went into lockdown. And I had several conversations with policymakers in Pakistan who were just starting to think about how COVID will impact the society, and what a difference the world has become over that period of just 4 months. Um, I think by now we're in a position where some of the impacts of this crisis, this pandemic, are becoming more and more clear. And one thing that we always found, although we've been sort of planning for this crisis maybe since mid-February, one thing that we didn't really have was a sort of an estimate or a number that we could peg ourselves to really plan for the impact of this crisis, and how we might go around mitigating the impact of this crisis. So what we've been working on with a small team, and this is joint work, because this has been quite complex, is to produce some numbers that we can that can help us inform how large is this impact. And I think what we really wanted was the number one that we could communicate with the public about. We could communicate with leading policymakers, including ministers of finance who look at budgets of education, and also with school leaders, that when we are in a stage where we can prepare again for school reopening, they know what to expect when kids come in. And so that's something I want to just shortly share with you, how we've gone about getting some of these numbers. We're trying to get those numbers out there now. Yesterday, if you want to read about this as a report on our website, just Google World Bank learning losses. There's a piece in The Economist yesterday that I think sets out many of the things that we're trying to say, and so you can read a little bit more as well if you're interested. But let me give you some of the headlines here in just the 7 minutes that I think I have left. So please proceed to the next slide, Sahar. As Belas told you, we already had a learning crisis before we started with this pandemic. And so the baseline that we have is not great. In fact, it's pretty bad. But we were also on a track as a global community to try and reduce that crisis substantially. In December, the World Bank introduced this concept of learning poverty, which means what is the absolute bare minimum that children need to be able to learn throughout their schooling careers and throughout their working lives, frankly. Which is that you need to be able to read and understand a basic paragraph. Now, in the world that we saw before COVID-19, about 53% of all children in the world were not able to learn to read and understand a simple paragraph by age 10. And we were on track and had a very ambitious plan together with policymakers around the world to try and reduce that by half in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, when this pandemic hit, we immediately recognized that this would be an enormous setback because school closures impact children very drastically. We know that from previous work, and some of that work has already been referenced. So we know that we have to recalibrate our strategy somewhat and accelerate. This is really a call for an acceleration of our rethinking of education system. So let's proceed, Sahar, to the maybe 2 slides ahead. So we sort of got together and tried to come up with an analytical model of how we can think about the learning losses. So imagine that children are on a path where they learn more every day that they go to school. So you sort of have an upwards sloping line. When you close down schools, which happens regularly because schools close for various reasons. Pandemics are one important reason, and there have been recent pandemics where we can learn on the impacts of that. There are school closures, let's not forget, every summer because of summer breaks. There are also school closures because of various natural disasters that happen, or they're school closures because of human actions like strikes or um, uh, other sort of effects. So we can learn from that literature and see how students' learning is affected. And basically we try and get at two sort of issues. So one is learning that does not take place while schools are closed because children are at home and maybe in their parental home there are no devices available to keep on learning. But there's also a second part, which is that students actually lose learning. One is a process of forgetting. Two is that they might be lost from the school system forever because as students disengage more and more from the daily activity of learning, they may never come back, and that's a huge worry. So let's proceed to the next slide. We have seen a lot of heroic efforts by many educators around the world to put in place remote learning strategies during the lockdown, including in Pakistan, where a lot of people have really come together, which was previously thought impossible to come up with new models of learning. At the same time, if you look across the world, there's enormous variation in the strength of the response. So there are different modalities on this picture of learning across different types of countries. And so in the low-income countries, which is the fourth column in every of these series, you see sort of the least strong response, and this has to do with two things: with a lack of capacity in the countries to respond, but also maybe a lack of capacity on the side of household to absorb remote learning. And that's something that I think in the context of Pakistan, we always need to keep reminding ourselves. Families, so about 2/3 of families in Pakistan have a television on which they can absorb the remote learning, and only about 1/3 of households have an internet connection on which they watch an online forum, and that becomes smaller if you imagine how households are actually sharing devices. So we're very worried about that. So sorry, I think you can skip ahead a little bit for the slides. So let me try and give you some headline impacts that we have estimated. So I think you can go to slide 7, where we try and estimate the effect of 3 different types of school closures. So what we try to come up with are 3 scenarios. So 1 is school closures of 3 months, 2 is a school closure of 5 months, and 3 is a school closures of 7 months. And this we call an optimistic, an intermediate, and a pessimistic scenario. And just to let you know, and that's why I started with this, we have seen school closures in Pakistan already at 4 months. So we're beyond the optimistic scenario in this place. And we try to look at the literature, what is reasonable in terms of the effects that we see of mitigation, such as remote learning, and this we call mitigation effectiveness. And then finally, we also looked at what is the likely effect on dropout. So we looked at what we call income elasticities. So when an income shock hits a family, how likely is it that they are pulling their children out of school because they want their children to generate income for the family or help out with household so the parents can both go out and generate income. And so we also come up here with a parameter for dropouts. Using that model and all the empirical data that we have available in our databases on learning levels and how much children learn during a normal school year, we can come up then with numbers of specific learning losses. So number 1 is what we call the effect on learning adjusted years of schooling. What does that mean? Is typically a student who goes through the entire education system, and I think you can skip ahead in the slide. So a typical student who goes through 12 years of schooling achieves 12 years of schooling, right? So by the end of high school. But when we correct that for the actual learning levels that students have, that number drops drastically. So in Pakistan, we know that an average student gets about 8.8 years of total learning, so spends 8.8 years in school. But when we correct for the amount of learning, that drops to 4.8 years of learning. So compared to the best country that offers that offers learning. So I think you can skip ahead, Sahar. So let me give you a sense of the impact of COVID and these school closures will have on learning globally. Is that we see that there's a drop of about 0.6 years of learning in the intermediate scenario, and that goes up to 0.9 years of learning in the pessimistic scenario. What we also did is translate how that would impact a person's salary over their lifetime. So one is, so I think you can skip ahead now to 2 slides. So the dollar values is where I am at now.
Cohen, we've got 1 minute maximum or 1.5.
Sorry, Bela. So I think, okay, let me say that the average person will lose about $16,000 in salary over their lifetime. And what's $16,000? That's about a year of average income that a person will get. And the world as a whole, we estimate, will lose $10 trillion in economic productivity. That's aggregated for all students in the entire cohort who's going to go to school now. $10 trillion is half the income produced by the US economy in a given year. And it is twice the amount that the world spends on education in the entire world. So let me end on that point. These learning losses are enormously costly, and we need to really take this as an enormously urgent moment to rethink our education system, to put in place those new forms of instructions that you mentioned, Bela, and to prepare last month or yesterday, and if not yesterday, today, for the moment that schools reopen, because our teachers will get children in their classes who not only have lost very important parts of their learning, but need to find new ways of learning as well. So if we can support our teachers to prepare for that moment, I think we will have, we really need to do it. There's a moral imperative here, not just a numerative one. Thank you very much, Bela, and I'll hand over to next.
Thank you very much, Cohen. That was really quite, you know, it was really broad and big and huge amounts of evidences, and especially the interplay between learning and income and the crisis as it morphs. But what needs to be prepared? Actually, I'm just trying to see in the Q&A, maybe we'll open the chat box. We don't have any particular question. We'll come back to the Q&A a little bit later and try and catch up for time. We'd like to move immediately in terms of setting the scene to Jonathan from RTI. Jonathan will be focusing on the measurement of learning losses, the mitigation, and also the key takeaways from his work, which is all over, but particularly in Ghana very recently. So over to Jonathan now, our second panelist.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Bela. And it turns out, I just realized that Cohen and I may have crossed paths in Pakistan earlier this year, because I also happened to be there until early March, just getting out before schools closed as well. So it seems to be a common theme among participants here. So I'm going to speak a little bit today about both how we've been thinking about measuring learning loss in some of our work at RTI, as well as Bella said, some of the mitigation plans that that we've been looking into, but also giving some key takeaways in terms of what I think it is that people should be focusing on when thinking about either providing, distance learning approaches or thinking about school reopening as well. So next slide, Sahar. I do apologize that I have a few transitions built into the slide, so I may, Sahar, end up asking you to click a few more times than I had intended to. But so the first thing here is just a few avenues of research into measuring learning loss itself. So one of the things we've been doing, we have the fortunate pleasure at RTI to have a lot of data sets across a lot of languages and countries where we can look at data from consecutive grades, which our approach was, if we can understand what a typical year's gain would be from, say, grade 2 to grade 3 in a given context, then we could use that information to model backwards and understand what might be a loss from of those typical gains or relative to those gains. So we've so far looked at just over 100 different data sets to try and get a sense of what this means globally. And I'm just going to show a few very brief examples of some of the trends that we're seeing there. As Bela mentioned, I've been working with Ricardo Sabates and Emma Carter at Cambridge University, as well as a few others, to examine, sorry, if we could go back to the first for a moment. Yeah, thanks, perfect. So looking with a few others at data from Ghana, where we were able to have longitudinal data looking at students who transitioned and seeing what the break, what type of learning loss they had during that time and what the factors were from the home environment that impacted it. And we're doing some studies looking directly at learning loss in a few countries as well. One click, please. So for mitigating learning loss, we're working in a number of different projects, trying to think through distance learning approaches and school reopening, which I'll talk about toward the end. And one more click. The main takeaway from this work, I think, is that learning loss is going to be large, but also very inequitable. I think struggling students, our fear is that they'll continue to fall further behind. And many of the distance learning approaches and school reopening plans don't necessarily take into account those who are most in need and potentially miss those who really need it. So next slide. One more. Perfect. So this is a somewhat tricky slide to follow. Don't worry too much. We're just going for the main takeaway here, so don't worry about the numbers exactly. But this is using data from Nepal from a couple years ago. This is one of the things we're doing across these 100 data sets. So we were looking at grade 2 and grade 3 scores for a typical school year in a national data set in Nepal. And what you see those bars there is that's the average learning increase in reading words per minute for typical students from grade 2 to grade 3, right? And you see that at the lower end there are many students who don't increase at all. Then you see a sloping line there where as students start reading better, they also start increasing more, with the biggest increases at the top end. So if you click twice, Sahar, you'll see that the focus that we really want to make sure we get people to understand is this bottom group, right? These learners who are reading less than about 10 words a minute or so at the end of the prior grade. These are the students who, with long extended breaks out of school, we actually are concerned about them losing anything that they had even learned up to that point. So in our modeling work that we've done so far, we actually find that, you know, if you look at that yellow bar, the reduced gains, right, you see that we might have reductions in gains by about half for students who are in the middle there, right, average readers, with a little less so for the top readers. But we see that there's no gain for the students at the bottom, meaning that we're exacerbating the inequality here, right? So we're not seeing the small gains we used to be seeing because those kids didn't have enough security and reading skills to be able to continue to catch up while out of school. Next slide. What this means in terms of just thinking about it for a school system or for a year of schooling. So this graph shows 3 lines there. This is data from Kenya, national data again. The blue line is the average scores, average reading ability across the distribution of grade 1 students at the end of the year. Red is grade 2 and gold is grade 3. So not surprisingly, you see that if you moved from the blue line to the red line, that would be the average increase from grade 1 to grade 2, right? But what we were looking at is trying to understand what the reduction in scores would be. So if you click once, please. You actually see that our predicted reading at the end of grade 2 or the start of grade 3 in Kenya will move down from that red line to where that green line is. And I know that this may be a lot of information. There's not enough time to necessarily spend going through the specifics of the slide, but if you click one more time, Sahar, what we see is in order to get back to where they were, they're supposed to go now from that green to the gold, right? So what we're seeing is that students are no longer starting where they were typically starting, but they're actually much closer to grade 1 students than they were to grade 2 students, right? So they actually would have to basically make up 2 years worth of schooling in a single year, which is why we have a concern about this not being able to just go through normal schooling in order to cover the ground that we need to cover. Next slide. And if you click 2 more times, please. So I'm just going to quickly go through this as well. The work that we've been doing in Ghana looking at learning loss, as we said, the main thing we're trying to understand is what are the home factors that impact learning loss. And we found that as an overall estimate, about 2/3 of the amount that was learned in the prior year was lost during a transition period of 3 months. This is just in a typical setting, not COVID specific. But we also found that students who had access to reading and counting activities at home, they reduced their learning loss by 43%. Students who were able to ask for parental support with work at home reduced their loss by just under half. And students who had comfort with the language of instruction in schools, their reduction of learning loss over the summer was 25 to 35%, right? And this is really important for us to think about these home factors that are impacting students as they're out of school or as they're transitioning back, and those who are most disadvantaged or don't have the resources at home are likely to fall further behind than their peers. Next slide, please. This will send around, but this is just a list of a whole bunch of things that we're working with different governments on in terms of responses to COVID. So a lot of radio and television programs that governments are working on, a fair amount of remote teacher trainings, as well as targeting health issues. These are all great measures, but I think if we click to the next slide, I want to talk finally, it'll be the final one, Bela, I promise, about what we think might be some of the most important takeaways from all of this. So the last slide. So as I started thinking through these data, these were really the 4 things that jumped out to me as the most important. One is that we need to assess learning again. So if you give 1 click here. What this means is assessing students when schooling restarts. starts, right? Cone presented some great information about the global impact on learning loss. We have data from certain countries where we're starting to look at this, but in any given system, you really need to know where students are when they return to school, right? We definitely can't just pick up where we left off and assume that 6 months out means that they are where they were when they stopped in March. And remediation really needs to be data-driven, not assumption-based, right? It's going to be difficult to set our remediation program before we know what students' starting points are, right? So I think assessing students at the beginning of school when they first return is going to be one of the key things. One more click. I think we want to focus on equitable solutions, right? So anything that we're doing for activities for both distance learning and school reopening need to focus on reducing, not exacerbating inequality. We all know the impacts of technology and some of the fascinating things people are doing, but even low technology approaches like radio programming or television, as Cone showed in his presentation, right? There are a lot of students without access. And even if they have a radio in the home, the time to sit down and watch, the support from the parents to be able to listen to a radio program or watch a television program, right, are likely to not reach those most in need. We need to focus on the most basic skills. As we saw, you're going to have large impacts for students who are really struggling with the most basic skills. And so restarting with the basics will be key. One more click. Understanding parents' needs, as I said, we can't assume more of parents now than we did before COVID began, right? We always knew that parents were going to struggle to support children at home in a lot of settings. But with distance learning measures or supplementary approaches, we can't now assume that parents will miraculously have more time or ability to support children than they did before. So providing additional home resources and support are essential, especially with overwhelmed parents. So potentially considering additional support from community volunteers or para-teachers may be a way to get more supports into the home. And lastly, the final click, thinking about reimagining schooling. So we don't want to just default back to the approach of, well, we'll push through and get through the curriculum as quickly as possible. I think as we saw, if students are starting a year behind, starting them with the standard curriculum for the grade that they were supposed to be in might not make a lot of sense, right? They're going to be at a lower level, and you're going to end up having more students fall behind further if you try and assume that their starting level is too high. We clearly need to increase access to materials and increase instructional time. I think we want to consider things around health, safety, school climate, and socio-emotional learning, a sensitive time for many children, and we want to take that into account with schooling. And I think lastly, it's a time for us to reimagine schooling more broadly, right? There are a lot of things that we think maybe haven't been working before, and we've never had the opportunity to really think through how we might want to change them, but we do for the first time now, right? And so thinking through what approaches might be most valuable to readjust. I mean, Pratham's work with Tarl, all of the teaching at the right level stuff is a fascinating approach to consider. Working more on structured pedagogies, I think, can be a really valuable approach for us to think more about. So just thinking innovatively about what we want to do with schooling that we may not have had the opportunity to consider previously. So I know, and I apologize, Bella, that I was well over time, but I will stop there. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a great segue. Thank you, Jonathan. But I think the recommendation slide on assessing learning, focus on equitable solutions, understanding parents' needs and reimagining schooling is essentially, these are great pillars, for us to move to immediately to Faisal Bari's presentation and conversation with us. And Faisal is going to be speaking, I believe, on the whole issue on the importance of home environment, as well as, of course, the aspect of the differentiated needs of learners and how can we localize our responses both within policy and practice. So over to Faisal. I'm trying to make up for time And Faisal, looking forward to your conversation. Faisal Bari,
So
School of
I will,
Education and Ideas.
thank you, Veda. So I'll probably be much shorter than the time that is allocated, so that will give you some space. So to the next slide. So I just want to talk about two aspects of learning deficit. The deficit is now well established by both Jonathan and Kun. They've given us some idea of how much the deficit is going to be. Now the question is going to be, how do we get to this deficit? Keep the context in mind. Sir, to the next slide, please. Keep the context in mind that we already have, we keep talking about this, that we have 20 odd million children who are out of school in Pakistan from 5 to 16. And the idea before COVID was we were trying very hard to go into both trying to think about how do you implement 25A and try to get education to those children, and also to how do you substantially change the quality of education being given, because report after report has been saying that the quality of education is low and has been low. So those were the two aspects that were becoming much more important in Pakistan in the dialogue. But now with COVID, we are actually faced with an even bigger sort of problem, which has to do with the fact that not only do we have to worry about the issue of those children who were out of school and the quality of education, we have to worry about the children who were in school, and a number of factors related to that, which is, will they all come back? If not, what happens to dropout? If we are moving to issues of a blended learning environment, what does that mean for children? Remember, schools in some ways are very special places. So are schools and universities. They are they produce a certain kind of equality, in the sense that once you enter the school, your home environment in some ways matters less. All children are in the same class. All children get to work with the same teacher. They have access to peer group and so on. But if you're going to move to models that are based on some notion of blending, and that blending has to do with staying at home and learning through some interaction through technology, then the home environment becomes very important as well. And that home environment, both at school level and at university level, is something we can't really control. And that's very important to understand. School environment is very controllable for us, but home environment isn't. So the fact that whether children have access to equipment, whether they have mobility, and this is gender differentiated, boys can move to internet cafes if need be, or any other place, girls can't usually. Whether there is a quiet space in the house, do children have a room of their own in which they have access to the tablet or computer or the telephone? Is the background quiet enough for them to be able to do class participation? A number of my students and people we've been talking to, children across various spectrum say they don't have that availability of a quiet home. They don't have rooms where they can sit and learn. Can they have chunks of time which are needed for concentration, for learning, right? You can't expect, even if you do asynchronous teaching, which is not non-live classes, you send videos, whatever material, children need time to work with them, on them in concentrated fashion. If they have other responsibilities and time commitments, they're looking after siblings, younger, older, if they have older people in the household, if there are sick people in the household and therefore responsibilities for everyone, then that makes it very difficult. And again, I keep saying this is differential in the sense that there is a higher impact, and this is coming through all our data that we're talking about, higher impact on girls and female young adults. They are supposed to take much more of the responsibility for household care, child care, for parental care, and they are also usually not given the space to work online and on computers. A lot of parents still don't associate online learning or being on the internet with education. They associate internet being on the internet by to doing things that are not really wanted, or playing games, or having social interaction. The idea that now education is moving to that space is very important, and in some ways that is important for parents to understand as well. Many of the parents are themselves not educated enough, or they might be barely educated, and so to understand the needs of online education becomes very hard. Now, even in September, when we open up schools, it's not clear yet whether this is going to be a full opening or not. A lot of people think that there's going to be some element of blending that will have to come in, definitely at the university level, but possibly at the school level as well. That creates very significant problems given the diversity in home environment. And as you can see from the factors here, there is a very strong correlation between these issues of home environment and income or status of the household. So the already existing inequality that happens because of income differentials is going to get even more exacerbated by relying on systems that will give differential access and understanding and ability to benefit from to boys versus girls, rural versus urban, rich versus poor, and that's going to create further problems. We are already seeing that in the sense that where government schools are still closed and haven't really thought very hard about online learning, many of the elite private schools have already moved their instruction in the summer vacations to online platforms. And so the gaps that we have been talked about by Jonathan and Kohn are already they are increasing substantially. Now, if those gaps continue to increase and the people in low-fee private schools, the children in low-fee private schools, as well as government schools, have to rely on either television or radio only, which have their strengths, but nonetheless is not the kind of instruction that, say, customized learning platforms give to in elite private schools. Those differences that we keep talking about are going to become even larger. So that, I think, now, because home environment is less open to us, we really have to think a lot harder about what do we do there if we are going for blended learning. Sahar, could we move to the next slide? That's the last slide. So in response, what do we have to do? I think we really need to think very hard about localized, differentiated policy responses. By level of schooling, as in a girl in grade 5 has a very different kind of probability of dropout than a girl in grade 6 or 8. Similarly, a rural boy or girl has a very different possibility of learning through online systems than an urban one. So level of schooling, geography, gender, and the learning loss that has happened over these 3 to 4 months, which is also differentiated by who you are, where you are. Jonathan made the point very clearly that if you have more home support, if you have more enabling environment at home, your learning loss is going to be less probably than those who don't have that kind of environment. So given that, teachers, principals, AEOs, EDOs, and their equivalents in the private sector have to be somehow empowered to actually give very differentiated local responses to these questions. And I haven't talked about, I've left this for the last, children with special needs are particularly vulnerable. We have seen that they have always had higher risk of dropout. They are always at a higher risk of being left behind from the learning process, etc. Now, when you move to new platforms and to blended learning, the idea that those platforms will be will be tailored or customized for children with special needs is probably too much to ask in Pakistan. It might happen in certain pockets, but it's not going to happen for the larger population. And so what we need to really think about is those 10-12% children, which are there in almost all population who have special needs. How are we going to tailor make this response for them? And I think where radio programs, television programs, etc., are great, and they need to come in, we need to think very carefully about very specialized local responses where teachers, principals, AEOs, and EDOs can do much better at trying to get to each child and trying to respond to the need for that particular child. It's a huge task to ask for from teachers and principals, etc. But that's the only way we are going to mitigate some of the impact that's going to come through COVID. Bela, I'll stop there and we can come back in questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal. In fact, you have responded to a couple of questions that were being asked. And, obviously we may not have satisfied everyone, but of course there is a question of how do you estimate learning losses for children with disabilities? How do you include the excluded? But thank you for, drawing in on the challenges in terms of the differentiated needs, but also looking at this home space. And there are questions related to that as well in terms of how do you address when parents get overwhelmed with these needs. So moving on to Kate's presentation. Thank you, Kate, for being a panelist today. I know it's so early with your little children. I can't thank all of you enough, especially in North America, who were joining from there. And Kate is going to look more into the whole area of the learning loss and the crisis in COVID-19, but looking at the home space and also the early years. So over to you, Kate, and we must stick to about 7 minutes because I want to give enough time also to Shahzad. Thank you, Kate. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Bela, and all of my panelists. I am not sure if I'm going to be as lucky as Cohen to have a sleeping child for this whole presentation, so I will definitely keep it quick. So I'm Kate Anderson. Next slide, please. And I work for an organization called Unbounded Associates. I'm the founder, and we support donors, NGOs, multilaterals, networks, and researchers to deepen their impact in the global education space. And so I'll be talking about a couple initiatives that some of the organizations we are working with have been doing. Given being presented with all of this data and the scale of the crisis can be somewhat overwhelming. And fortunately, there are a couple advocacy initiatives that we can all get involved in social media, through interacting with our governments. So if you kind of are feeling like, what can we actually do today or over the next few months, there's a couple ideas in here. So the three areas that I've seen are important are focusing on the most vulnerable, which we've talked about. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the youngest children and children who were facing humanitarian crises before this one, just because those are the projects that I've been working on. But of course, children with disabilities, in some cases girls, children from racial and ethnic minorities, depending on the context, would be considered the most vulnerable. I'll talk about how it needs to be part of a holistic package. So learning and learning outcomes being one component of many that are important. And then a little bit on the resources and financing that will be needed after the crisis ends and we start building back. Next, please. So focusing on the most vulnerable next. Many of you are familiar with this graphic or something like it, but in the earliest years, there's a variety of risk and vulnerability factors that influence child development, and also a lot of protective factors. And so we know that infants, toddlers, and very young children are at risk of being negatively affected by this crisis because of the impact of the pandemic on their caregivers, and also the interrupted access to critical care and learning opportunities. And this is from a toolkit developed by the Moving Minds Alliance. that lays out the case for why it's so important to invest in young children, especially those who've experienced crises before this current crisis. Next slide, please. Another note about children in humanitarian context. So we've there's a lot of data on the learning crisis before COVID-19 and some great emerging data on it during the crisis. Unfortunately, children who are already in situations of conflict or natural disaster are less likely to have their learning counted. They're less likely to be in schools where learning is measured. They're less likely to be in a traditional house or household where learning is captured. And even when they do have opportunities to have that learning measured, the cognitive face for all the things happening in their environment is often much higher than their peers, and so they're not able to maybe perform on an assessment as well as some of their peers who aren't facing all of these difficulties. They've already experienced disruptions in their education trajectories. It's difficult to count which children have been affected by conflict or emergencies, partially out of the desire not to stigmatize them, but it does make it difficult. They might be excluded from learning assessments due to data collection protocols, which don't, for the safety of data collectors or enumerators, they're not going into areas affected by emergencies. And this was, we laid this out in a recent report for the INEE, Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies. Next slide, please. So we know, and from my colleagues who've already presented, that the scale of the crisis is very big. And so, when we think about what supports are needed for the most vulnerable children, it goes beyond just those academic supports, as it should for all children. Next slide, please. So this is something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the nurturing care framework, but I just wanted to talk about it a little bit in the context of COVID. So the components of nurturing care that are critical in early childhood, but all through our development and even as adults, you'll see that opportunities for early learning is just one of the components. Good health has been what I think most governments and families are focused on right now, keeping everyone healthy. And at some, in some cases that comes at odds with some of these other areas. So adequate nutrition, parents who are not working, who cannot get out to get food for their families. We're seeing cases of that, and I have a little bit of data on that later on. Responsive caregiving, it's just difficult. Households are under so much more stress. Security and safety, especially for households where child protection and abuse are issues, and sometimes where the school or a preschool program might be the safe place that a child goes to every day. Now that's no longer there, and so that's something that's also exacerbated. Next slide. And this is also information from the Moving Minds Alliance toolkit, but, and I know that there was a question on this about what's happening in households. So a recent survey by Plan found that 83% of Syrian caregivers did not have enough food to last for the next 2 weeks. And a study by UNICEF, UNHCR, and WFP in Jordan found that 41% of refugee families noted that their children's well-being is affected. 21% reported less tolerance and treating children badly, and 21% reported an increase in family conflict. And these are over, the baseline, which might be quite a difficult situation to begin with. Next slide. So given the scale, we know that not only do we need to keep the amount of resources that we already have, but also increase them given what's to come, and especially for the most vulnerable. Early childhood, we know, is a great time to invest to prevent later remediation, and for children in humanitarian contexts, represent some of the most vulnerable in the world. So at a time when we do need even more resources, especially for the most vulnerable, education budgets are in there's a possibility that education budgets are going to be cut and aid to education as we're in a global economic crisis as well. Next slide. So this is one campaign that's just kind of getting started right now called Save Our Future. It's been in response to the fact that we're seeing aid and also budgets for education being threatened. And the estimates are between 50 and 150 billion in 2021 alone that are at risk of being cut. So this is really a campaign to amplify the voices of children and young people as they call on leaders to save our future, and it aims to protect education as a sector as we build back. And there's a variety of events going on for this. On the next slide, you'll see all of the organizations that are involved in this. So it's, next slide, really a collective effort of all of these organizations that are leading globally. And there's opportunities to be involved for researchers, for youth, for kind of anyone who is interested and wants to make sure that we're protecting education as we begin to build back. So on my final slide, here's just a couple resources for you. If you are interested in, looking for something that you can do right now. So there's the Moving Minds Alliance Toolkit, and that has some great graphics and statistics and actions for governments, humanitarian organizations, non-government organizations, and most of those things are very applicable to all young children, especially those in humanitarian crises, but really things like child protection and family economic stability apply everywhere. Following the hashtag Save Our Future or the Education Commission on Twitter, they're going to be launching a youth survey in the coming weeks, and would really appreciate everyone's help in getting that out to your networks and the youth that you know. And again, there's an opportunity for some of the other issues that we've talked about today, children and youth with disabilities, to really make sure that those voices are heard in this global campaign. And then, of course, the Nurturing Care Framework, which just has great tools for digital advocacy if you're looking for tools to kind of help make the case around the importance of that holistic nurturing care framework. So thank you so
Kate.
much.
Thank you, Kate, and we really need to move right along, but it's wonderful to have that perspective, across the spectrum to the early years and also to the home environment and what kind of resources are available. Dr. Shehzad Jiva, it's absolutely a pleasure to welcome you to this. And there are lots of questions because we know that the government of Pakistan has been doing some extraordinary work in supporting children and giving all kinds of support through the television, the PTV, the Tele-Taaleem, Taaleem Ghar, etc. Lots of things are happening, but many big decisions were taken on automatic promotion to grade 9, new ways of evaluation. People are really in a quite challenged. So Shehzad Jiva Sahab, we would like to really ask about how overwhelming it has been for lay parents and even for children to address these issues of automatic promotions. And what do you think will be the responses once the school open on being able to handle issues of curriculum, even the kinds of assessments that should happen for diagnosis purposes to see what the learning loss looks like, and how can we address issues of learning in the new normal so that at least we'll have some meaningful outcomes. So over to Shehzad Jiva Sahab. Can we, Shehzad, are you there?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm there.
Thank you.
Just to warn you, in Karachi, we've just, this rain started here. So, we have a very fragile electricity situation in the countries. If I may log off, I will join back soon. But you can move on to the question answer session if you'd like. So let's begin, and hopefully the electricity remains. So as my role would be here to give you insights on the local scenarios, what kind of decisions was made during this crisis, how they were made, and what was going on behind the scenes there. As you had already mentioned here that in Pakistan and also around the world, the governments are working to respond to the unexpected outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And globally, there was a report that 188 countries have closed down their education institutions, which led to estimated 1.6 billion students to be out of school. So this is indeed an unprecedented situation in the history of the education. As you mentioned that a lot of stakeholders like students, parents, schools are apprehensive and stressed about the current scenario, how they'll be promoted to the next level, what kind of curriculum would be taught. This all brings to another anxiety at the policy makers as well, because they are also faced with massive challenge and the kind of challenges we have within our country, that is high population, fragile education system already we are facing with, to deal with all those things and coming up with a solution which is equitable and fair for all is going to be a huge challenge. Whatever decisions the government have taken or would be taking would be criticized. I'm not defending the government or anyone, but since I've been a part of the discussion, that is why I've made this statement. Coming to the decision of the examination decision and the promotion decision that was made, in Pakistan, you can say, we were about to end or about to begin our final or summative examinations in the country. And so we could assume that students have spent their time in the school to complete their curriculum. And those students who were private candidates and appearing for the exam, and they had registered, we could again assume that they were prepared to appear for the examinations. But the decision was made to shut down the schools across the country. The initial decision was to delay the examinations and have the examination later, but things started to unfold in a way that showed us that conducting examinations of 4 million students from grade 9, 10th, 11th, and 12th would be a huge task and cause many different kind of pressure on the government of taking the decisions to take the exams. Many countries, delayed the exams initially, like Azerbaijan, Ghana, Gambia, Hong Kong, Kenya, Nigeria, Slovenia, South Africa, many other countries, Vietnam, they delayed the examinations. Some countries did cancel the examinations, like UK, Bahrain, Pakistan eventually did, India, Bangladesh, Netherlands. So, one size fits all is not possible, and many countries took certain decisions based on their own scenarios. The kind of decisions that we had to take in Pakistan for grade 1 till grade 8, we had to promote the students to the next level, again, assuming they had completed their curriculum, because everybody had finished their term and they were left with only 1 month of education. But then when it came to high-stake examinations, where these outcomes through these examinations determines the admissions to colleges and universities, there was a lot of complexity. So, the first step was to delay the exams. Then we went on to, if we delay the exams, let's go on to only MCQs level, multiple choice question, and assess them. So it will be much more manageable. But as things unfold, we had to come up with a recommendation from the IBCC point of view to ensure validity, fairness, equity of the decisions, and also to ensure continuity of the system impacting 4 million students in the country. We were lucky that we had some kind of reliable data in the country. So the system is such, students of grade 9 give half of the curriculum of the exams, and in grade 10, they do the other half of the curriculum. So we could use those data of the ability in grade 9 to determine and predict how they would perform in grade 10th, and similarly for grade 11th and 12th. And we use data of around 1 million students from the country, that is representing over 30% of the examination boards in Pakistan. We have around 33 government examination boards in the country. Why that was challenging is because, you know, we have 18th Amendment in our constitutions, which gives right to the provinces and the power to the provinces to make decisions for themselves. So to bring alignment to all, there was consultations from all the provinces to come up with this kind of a decision. A lot of examination boards haven't announced their decisions yet. However, from the ministry's point of view, they're very clear about the decision which was taken in consultations with the leadership of all the provinces. Coming to the school reopening decisions, there is a lot of discussions that has happened within the government, how to open the schools, when to open the schools. And if you see the trend, we started off by saying in March, shut down the schools. And then we said we'll open the schools on the 15th of June. Then we came up with 15th of July, 15th of August, and now 15th of September. I think it may go on to 15th of October as well, depending on the situation. So a lot of SOPs, but the good thing about here is that they've allowed the teachers to come to school to do the planning of how they will run the academics and ensure that the curriculum that they will teach is manageable. This is, I'm talking about both public and private sector. However, the curriculum will be determined how much they should be taught by the government themselves. The schools have been asked to develop strict SOPs based on the guidelines of the government. There's a recommendation to go on with staggered classroom, having less number of students. This could be manageable in the private sector school, but in public sector, as you know, this could be very, very challenging. I have seen myself, there are like 70 to 80 students in one classroom, which has a space of barely 33 or 35.
Hello? 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 Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Bela. I think it's
okay.
Dr. Shahzad we lost, unfortunately.
I know. I think Karachi is having some phenomenal rains, and Karachi K Electric is also playing some terrible games on the with the lives of the people of Karachi. It's been 14 hours of blackouts, etc. But Shahzad has been in this terrible state of being able to come to a consensus with complex decisions on automatic promotions, knowing full well that teachers and schools are going to be facing students returning with very complex needs and very complex diagnosis of where they stand and what to do, how will they manage the curriculum. While Rukmani says, go easy on the curriculum, go look at the foundation. Now, how will you look at what will be seen as foundational learning at lower primary, at upper primary, at middle, at higher secondary? These are all very complex questions. And certainly, as we've seen today in our presentations, right from what Poon was suggesting and sharing with us the post-COVID optimistic, intermediate, and pessimistic situations, where he said Pakistan was already past the optimistic space. It's all going to be very complex. Are our teachers ready? Are our parents ready? These are like, big issues. Is the system ready? And, the research that's showing that both Koen and Jonathan, you shared with us, we've seen complexities. And I think those complexities are in front of us, and I think for all the people to see, how the governments from the policy making point of view will make those decisions, and how will we address the issues of those most marginalized. Those questions have come up again and again. There is a question which can be responded by all of us here. And that question, why can't you show the pictures?
I'm back.
The question, okay. So the questions is, if we can take that first question, and is there any evidence? Oh, Shahzad, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. If you want to take the go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Shahzad. Please, I would love for you to finish first. And we come back to the questions later. Please go ahead.
My apologies to everyone. So
No, we were expecting. That's all right.
So I was talking about the school's decisions in terms of SOPs, staggered classrooms to be taken. These are the kinds of decisions that they have taken. But how that is going to be managed, especially at the public sector school, is going to be very, very difficult. And also at the private schools, because as you know, more than 80% of the private schools are low cost, low fee charging schools, and they have very, very low resources in terms of managing those. Already a lot of schools are closing down their business, especially I'm talking about the low fee charging schools. Any child who is in that school and that school closes means they are the dropouts. The government do not has the capacity to absorb those students, neither do other private schools. But let's see how hopefully the things will improve. We will have a good SOP and school will resume by 15th. In terms of the curriculum, since there's already a delay in the academic year, so as one of our speakers did mention that you'll have to come up with different strategies to address this. My concern over here is whenever any changes happens within the curriculum, how much it is to taught or how much it is not to taught, there's a lot of communications and training involved. Right now, we don't have enough reaction time. So how that would be possible is something, let's think, allow time to unfold and see. But there are ways to look at the curriculum. By trimming down the curriculum, you have to look into the area of, to see within the curriculum what is the most essential, which is good to know and which is nice to know. And you can trim down the nice to know bits, or maybe some of the good to know, and the essentials to know could be remain there. But again, you've got grade 1 till grade 12. You've got numerous subjects to be taught in the classroom. This is a huge task. Who will do it? How that will be done? How that would be done accurately is a big task and a challenge. The other ways to do is either you cut down some of the chapters from the subjects, again looking at which is essential and good to know and nice to know. My recommendation is if there's further delay in opening the schools, then I think the government should focus on the core subjects, that is literacy, numeracy, and scientific literacy only. If that is done, we may be able to cope up with managing the curriculum, because management of curriculum is essential, because the workload has to be, will come on teachers and to students. And as Faisal was saying, some kind of blending would happen. I think so too, that would happen. And there could be a second wave of COVID where the school is shut down again. So, just focusing on literacy, numeracy, and scientific literacy would be crucial for us to go on. The last I would like to address is the social and mental well-being of the students. The children of the world globally are living in fear of seeing people getting COVID, fear of their family members getting COVID, fear of people dying and listening to what's happening. You can't stop the news coming in their ears. And possibly some within their own families are becoming victims of COVID and losing their lives and cannot survive the virus. And there, I think we need to build a resilient society. How that is incorporated in our curriculum, how we would measure that, the resilience among students would be key. We don't have answers. I think even globally, world doesn't have the answers. Developed countries are also suffering. They don't have the answers. But we can best utilize our resources. We would expect everyone to get involved and participate to make this world, this country, a safer place for all. Thank you very much, Bela.
Thank you, Shahad. That was an excellent expose, and really you have again shared the complexities around this, the whole area of looking at aspect of social emotional learning, looking at what is good in the curriculum and what is nice in the curriculum, and looking at what those essential pillars are to hold on to. But it's just been excellent. We don't have much time, but I really wanted to throw this one question. We've asked for 10 minutes more. And one very big question, lots of questions have been answered already in the Q&A panel. So thank you to the panelists who've been very diligently answering those questions. But one very overarching question has come. Instituting changing learning paradigm is not without cost associated with it. Aspect of cost in terms of changing learning paradigm needs to be accounted for and modeled. And I think wherever we're looking at reimagining education, changing the paradigm of education, looking at the whole area of the school and the home and the child and learning and assessments, I think those aspects are very lively indeed. And this one question, I think I would love to see each one of you respond, with a 1 minute. We have only 1 minute for each panelist. But I think this whole notion of changing the learning paradigm, giving the situation, the complexity of learning losses, what do you think? What kind of costs are we talking about? Kohan has already mentioned that we should have started our planning in March when it all happened. We're already late. And now we're talking about a change in paradigm, reimagining education. What do you think? What are your last parting shots on that very big question being asked on changing of the learning paradigm?
Thank you, Bela. One reason why we estimate a learning and earning loss as well is because we're very worried about education budgets. So we want to tell policymakers that if they do not act and do not recuperate these learning losses, we will face a bigger cost than investing in education. So absolutely, we must invest in education more than ever before. And that needs to come from government budgets. We as a bank are also investing more in education today than we did 4 months ago, and we'll continue to do that. But we also must change. So it's not a measure of just investing more, it's also investing differently. And so that's where your question really comes in. I think we need to invest more in specific forms of teaching and looking at how practices can change in the classroom. And we need to support teachers to plan for when schools reopen, particularly to focus on the very basics of reading, of basic numeracy for everyone. Because every child that will come back to school in September, if schools will reopen in September, will have been struggling with the basics. Have they been reading at home? Most likely not. The average family in Pakistan has 1.5 books at home, out of which 1 book is the Holy Quran. Can we expect them to have been practicing? No. So they must be practicing the very basics again. Every child will need to practice the very basics again in the classroom, and for that, teachers will need support. Thank you.
So it's not just budgets, it's got to be much more than that. And Jonathan, you lay down very nicely a framework on the recommendation side. Again, that is tantamounts to really a change in the way we think about education altogether and things going together. What are your parting thoughts on this whole business about changing the learning paradigm?
Yeah, I think Con's point is a great one about the budget. I think the concern from my end on that side is that we now have more of a competing budget than ever before. So there's obviously health sector needing a lot of this, and so how much budget will continue to be provided to the education sector. I think it's essential that we increase and not reduce, but it's going to be hard with competing responsibilities. But I do agree that for me the biggest thing is returning to the basics. I think that the last point Dr. Shahzad made about the learning competencies in the Philippines, they've just done this where they've gone through their entire curriculum and reduced it to 25% and focused on what they refer to as the most essential learning competencies. And they're focused mostly on improving basic skills to get students back on track before they try and return to the state where they were a couple years ago, recognizing this is a long-term thing and there are likely not going to be immediate short-term solutions that will solve the problem.
Thank you. Faisal, your comments, given your presentation and your discourse on the home environment and the need for localized differentiated policy response?
2 or 3 things. One is that my fear is that on the public sector side, the response is going to be fairly standard, which might just be that we just reduce a few chapters and that's about it, but don't prepare teachers, because I mean, if we were preparing teachers, we should be really having trainings now and starting to think about what should be done when the schools open. So we're going to be late on that. We'll probably just reduce some chapters and say do the rest of it, and so on. The other thing, but whereas we have other options, I mean, we could expand. We don't have to recover everything during the next year. We could take longer also. It's not necessary to think about a recovery in just the next few months, etc. We could spread it out a little and make sure that that we have a more solid recovery in the next year and a half. Just one small thing, I think so a lot of people are very worried about public sector expenses and public sector schools. I'm actually very worried about private sector schools. Public sector has a system where there is some money that's going to go, teacher salaries and others are all guaranteed and so on. Private sector schools, and Shahzad also said, most of them are low fee. They are really struggling. And many of them will not be able to open back in September. And so what is the state and government and the society planning for that? That I think needs very serious consideration.
So I think, thank you so much, Faisal. And I think the issues are really stark and they're competing challenges, and with resources being constrained as they are, even though we may think out of the box, but there's some things which are just staring us in the eyes, and it's going to be extremely tough to negotiate between those grand ideas of a changing paradigm to just pure survival and children being able to get into school, and especially girls. And Kate, your thoughts on this from your perspective, the way you presented the issue of learning losses and also early years and homes.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the ways that we can support children that does not cost anything is by supporting their families to talk to them more in the household, to have conversations, to just do small things on a daily basis that support their children's learning at home for as long as they're planning or they're going to be needing to be in the home. There's been initiatives. One of my colleagues former colleagues at Brookings, Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, has been working on this idea of learning landscapes, where you take everything in the environment, not just in the school or home, to be a learning opportunity. So signs in the marketplace that say, talk to your children about, and have them count the fruit or tell you the colors of it, things like that. There's opportunities for learning everywhere in the environment. And so if we're faced with budget shortfalls and We know that we have a greater need and less funding. Trying to kind of capitalize on parents as children's first teachers could be a way to kind of mitigate some of those losses.
I think many exciting innovations are taking place where you're beginning to see parents become very active and older siblings become active. And we're seeing so many of those innovations, but I think they need to be put out from the informal to the formal space. And I think we'll hear more on that, but love to hear Shehzad's take on these kind of shifting landscapes of learning. And when people talk about paradigm change, do you think the government is interested or will be willing to explore these kind of options for both learning and assessments, Dr. Shehzad Jiva?
They'll have to, because at least that is doable in from grade 1 till grade 8. We've got amazing people in the country. You know, we've got innovative people who've already done a lot of work in the past, before COVID, even I'm talking about. And when COVID started to happen here in the country, in many forums, when I mentioned about especially one area of developing social values in the country among our children. I don't know if you've heard of Kayat Se Baatein, work done by Daniel Nurani. It's absolutely amazing. You know, I've recommended to government at many forums. It has not been put on the television yet, but those who have resources and those who have seen that animated videos found them very, very interesting for young children and even for adults as well. So these kinds of animated videos are available, which those who have technology can use those things. Having content specific on Teletalim, yes, it's good, but how effective it is, because there is lack of monitoring, Faisal was talking about the same, that would be a challenge. The major challenge would be on the area of secondary and higher secondary level. If we are unable to come up with any solutions there, like online examinations, online testing, a proper infrastructure for online education, we would see very university examinations next year, because we could not find a solution to continue our education. That means no admissions in the university next year. And that means many of the private university may shut down because they won't have for admissions. There is no support from the government to any private sector, either being schools or universities. What Faisal was saying earlier, what they are thinking about private for them, there is no. That's my take on this.
Thank you very much. It has been absolutely an awesome afternoon, morning for all of you here. But really, thank you to. Hello. It's been absolutely great. I wanted to thank each one of you, Cone Given, Jonathan Stern, Kate Anderson, Faisal Bari, Dr. Shehzad Jiva, for being with us, sharing absolutely very precious thoughts. Things are complex. This is a complex topic. This is just the beginning of a conversation, and we hope that many more will join this conversation as we seek solutions of the way forward. When we look at the juxtaposition of the economic crisis, the health crisis, and the education crisis, and of course with that a social emotional one, things are not going to be easy. But I think it is vital, and thank you to the audience and the participants who joined us with wonderful questions. Some of them have been answered. If any have been left unanswered, we will immediately get back to you by Monday on those questions. But we will have the recording posted out to you, as well as the presentations to all registered participants, and it'll be on our Facebook and our Twitter accounts as well. Once again, thank you on behalf of Idara Talim Agahi, the ASER team, which has been looking at this whole issue of learning crisis and learning losses. And we hope that we will continue to grow as a learning community. Thank you very much. This is the second in the series of our webinars. As we continue to move forward, the next one is going to be on early years. Thank you, everyone. Can't thank all of you enough, the panelists as well as the participants.
Thank you. Good office.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.